All right, so um, I've been working on fabric a little bit this month. I've got a whole bunch of different sketches, and so I've been working on things like that. And so I just did one kind of rough painting to kind of show you the process of how I worked on this. So what I did is use the reference that's posted uh, next to this as a kind of piece and kind of build up and go from there. And I started out with the basic gesture and then just kind of sketched it out. Now, I'm not what I would call a painter, where most of these painter guys block it out, and I think that's something I want to really work on, and try and build up that idea of creating a more painterly effect and using blocks to build instead of line work. So that's probably my next set here. I'm going to work more on anatomy and kind of flesh out more of that aspect of my talent tree. And so what I'm going to do is that'll be my next kind of idea. And so I'm using the reference and I'm kind of roughing it out real fast, just using straight lines, things like that. And I refine the work more as I kind of build it out. So that's something that I'm kind of fleshing out here. And so with the reference in place here, working on my laptop here, I'm just going to block out the base colors and keep the line work separate. Now on this file here, I've got all my sketches, so I just kind of picked one of my sketches and went further towards it. Now I'm blocking out pretty much everything just to kind of rough out the idea. Then I picked a different color here and went from that rough color and just blocked it out again, just to get my base colors down. And so then I really quickly blocked out the arms and the face and things like that in order to get the rough idea of my color process down. So as I continue just to fill in these rough spaces, um, the real rough ideas of the solid colors. From there, I essentially just start taking a little bit more of the shadow and kind of fleshing out the shadow as major points. And so here you can see me just taking a darker color and kind of going through and roughing out the block colors for each particular section. And a side note, starting this new job has been kind of frustrating. It's a lot of fire problem solving type of thing where I'm just constantly, asked to use my ideas to fix everybody else's problems. Everything from scheduling to just a number of different things, and it's kind of killing my ideas, my creativity and workflow as I work on this thing. So this is like, I have time for little ideas, and I've been doing a lot more thumbnails, which I'll kind of post during my week here. But one of the things that I've been having trouble with is just trying to get back into the groove of, wanting to paint, wanting to do stuff every night, and that's kind of really a frustration point as of late. And so if anybody has any ideas on how to kind of move past it, I'd much appreciate it. It's part of it's getting back into the routine of doing things, but the other part of it is, I spend all day basically writing, documenting, and things like that. So it's just kind of a frustrating kind of aspect. And here, as you see, I'm basically painting in highlights. I'm doing a two-tone color system, keeping it simple, keeping it just real basic, and I think that's one of the major points that I get too much into different colors and I want to like add in too much lighting and too much information. And I think that just by adding in that aspect, it gets a little bit more muddier palette. And so here you can see I'm just lightening the line work and really pushing that line work into the background as I paint more and more. And I'm refining, I'm going through and I'm refining the bigger blocks that I make according to the reference. Now, I'm not doing this 100% perfect because for me, this is kind of a practice sketch just to get the idea of clothing, to get the idea of wrinkles, and things like that. And so this is something that I'm just kind of roughing through and painting through. Just to get me the regular ideas. Now I'm going here and I'm kind of painting in the darks. And so all I'm doing is breaking down the real strong darks in order to get that emphasis on the extra form going on. And at this point, I really haven't focused on the face. I just wanted more focus on the wrinkles and things like that. So one of the things that I'm doing here is going through and just kind of roughing out the features of the face. So I'm putting in the nose and erasing out some of the highlights and things like that, or erasing out some of the features in order to kind of really emphasize the facial features themselves. And I think the face is the most important, even though I'm focusing on wrinkles and clothing. I think the face is the most important thing in any piece with a character in there. And I think that's one of the things that we, like I really focus on and really enjoy the faces, and which is strange because I don't do many portraits, and I should work on a couple portraits. I think that would be something of interest. And I'm adding in a little bit more color here, a little bit more life, high pinks and stuff like that in the face to get a little bit more of the detail and color base going on. Now, as I do this, as I flesh out the face, you'll notice that the line work that I have is not quite 100%. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to adjust the face accordingly. And so you'll see me like moving pieces around and things like that. And the painting method doesn't, I'm really not strong with it. I use line work, and that's kind of how I always have done things. So I'm using these lines just to kind of sketch out the nose and kind of give me a much more interesting kind of facial kind of contour. And I think that helps me out when defining, just little bits and pieces. It helps me refine it. I can rescale, resize, and kind of paint over everything. And I think always that helps me, like, just kind of try and revert my work into much more refined. Whereas the painting method, I tend to find that it's one of those things that I just, no matter how much I block things out, it just doesn't make sense to me because of the way I learned how to do things. So as you can see, I've got that line work in there, and I think that helps me out quite a bit. And I'm just kind of going through and kind of resizing the face, getting a little bit more interest going on in the character. And now what I'm going to be working on next is that flower. And I looking at this after I recorded everything, I realized I forgot the feathers in there, but that's okay. I was really much more working on getting the values down for the wrinkles, and I think that I think I was relatively successful in doing that. So as you can see, I'm just putting in a little bit more darks into the reds, and that's going to help out and build out that. And then now I'm adding some real quick highlights to implement and kind of push in that aspect of developing this character, developing the idea of the facial form and things like that. And one of the things that you have to realize is when you're doing this, your lighting is really key in what you're doing. So like on this, the lighting is pretty much straightforward on the character, and it's not really high contrast. Yes, there's really darks in there, and there's really bright highlights, but there's no real like harsh light and shadow information going on. And I think that's one of the things that you want to always pay attention to is how your reference is. Because if you start out with better reference, and I just grabbed this from stock footage, and the stock footage was perfectly fine for my practice, and I feel that the stock footage worked out well. But if I were to like make this a little bit more dramatic, I really need to emphasize much more of the lighting in there, and I think that's something that you need to kind of do a little pre-planning and put that information in there. And so as I'm just working on the pieces, this is basically a step-by-step process. Very simple, very I don't have to think much for it. I'm just basically looking at colors, and I'm kind of adding those colors in there. And I think that's one of the things that I'm really struggling with is like this is boring kind of once you start on this kind of process, you're pretty much in cruise control. You don't really have to think about much. It's just a matter of putting highlights and darks and matching that in. And I think one of the things that I'm really kind of struggling with right now is the frustration of trying to think of new ideas, especially when my brain is pretty much fried by the time I get a chance to sit down and do my own work. And so once I'm done with this, I'm pretty much just going through and cleaning up, the hands and things like that, kind of roughing out the general features and turning everything into kind of a little bit more refined bits and pieces of this particular uh, study. And I think that's one of the things that I really sit down and break down. Like here you can see I'm just deleting, just drawing with the lasso tool and just deleting the rough sketch, and that's going to refine the line work a little bit. I'm adding a little bit more colors to the cheeks and kind of blending things out a little bit more in order to kind of get the idea of a little bit more refined form in there. And I think with the way the lighting is, the form is kind of flat on the picture, so the form I think is turning flat into the scene or into the painting as well. And so I think one of the ways that I kind of fix that is to put a gradient from top to bottom. And I think putting a gradient from top to bottom basically allows me to kind of add in a little bit more detail and focus on the bigger areas where I think the more of the face and things like that. And I think that's one of the ways to kind of push the idea. And here what I'm doing is I'm adding a little bit more lighting into the edge so I can get away from that flattened feel. And I think that's one of the ideas that I'm having issues with is it looks really flat. Even though I've got the wrinkles and everything like that in there, it still feels really flat. And so I'm pushing the darks a little bit darker. I'm giving a little bit more highlights in places that I know that the highlights don't exist. And here I'm, I kind of switch focus and I'm working on the leg. And the leg is okay, but it's not the right shape and form. So one of the things that I'm doing is going through and kind of roughing out, again with my line work, just the general overall shape. And then from there I can go in and I can erase and clean up and kind of form the leg a little bit more than what I was doing before. I'm And here I'm putting in kind of this airbrush look, and I'm just roughing out the airbrush and erasing it and refining it. And the airbrush just added me to give me a little bit more form, a little bit more at a faster pace. And I think the airbrush is, as long as you don't use it on every part of the painting, it works to just kind of rough out the general forms and things like that of your idea without smoothing out the painting too much. And again, I'm just adding a little bit more highlights here and pushing in and developing that process. And the highlights kind of add a little bit more form. But again, the idea of my leg is not, it's kind of flat and kind of boring. So I think one of the things that I'm going to go do is just kind of push a little bit more of the emphasis on just different parts of the form. And that is something that I think I need to kind of just emphasize a little bit more on my paintings. Some of them feel flat. I think that adding better form would help that out. And here I'm just drawing in a more refined version of the shoe just to kind of get the base idea. And I don't even put a background or anything like that in there. This is just kind of a rough sketch for what I'm working on. Again, it's more of a study for wrinkles and things like that. And here's where I add the gradient, and I move the gradient up and stretch it a little bit and darken it. And I think that adds a lot more emphasis onto the rest of the drawing, and it feels like it's much more kind of pushed towards in your overall kind of idea. And then what I'm doing here is just adding in the little details, stitching and things like that. And it's just hash marks real quick, not very refined, not very perfect. And I think that adds in quite a bit of a little bit more idea reference. And I'm pushing the form, especially on the arm where there's no real shadow variation. I'm adding in my own shadow to just kind of emphasize that lighting a little bit more. And you can see here I'm just, again, adding a little bit more highlights, a little bit more shadows, just to kind of push my ideas of form a little bit more. Now, I could have added a texture on top of this, and it's something that I might do down the road, but I think the texture adds quite a bit of chaos to, like, if I would actually go in there and add a little bit more texture to everything, I think this plain brown leather works a little bit more. Whereas if I'd add in a texture, it would really kind of emphasize, it would really flatten out the piece. So that's one of the things that I'm looking at by not doing that. And so again here, just adding a real quick gun, and I'm just using basic shapes, squares, and I'm cutting it out, painting dark and painting light. And that is just a real quick, like I said, the gun is not my priority. It's the everything else is kind of the study of what I'm working on. So there I'm adding in, just a lot more, less detail, just kind of real roughing the idea. I'm getting back to the shoe and adding in my solid blacks, things like that. And, again, it feels very flat, and then I have to go back in and put in the highlights and putting the emphasis of laces and things like that. Again, this is more of a study, so it's not the refined polish that I should have, but it gives me the rough idea of what I'm kind of trying to accomplish. So again, as I just really roughly refining this, and one of the areas that needs more work is the kind of underskirt, if that's what you call it. The underskirt is something that needs to be refined, so I'm going to spend a little bit more time here, kind of after I put some buttons in and things like that. But I'm going to go in, and I think the underskirt is a little bit too dark. So the first thing I'm going to do is go through the underskirt and just kind of highlight it a little bit more, change the lighting, unify it a little bit more. And I think that's one of the things that I'm working on next here. I'm just kind of refining hands and putting little bits and pieces in there. And overall, I think this is about 2 hours worth of work. So I mean, I didn't really spend a lot of time on this. It was kind of that idea of getting more familiar with wrinkles and working on the focus of things. Specifically form. The anatomy on here is pretty basic and kind of hidden. So, one of the things I did was really focused on that drapery and just adding in little bits and pieces. And here's where I lighten it a little bit to kind of set off the contrast a little bit more. And I think then adding in some of the darks really sets apart the rest of the particular piece. And so again, just getting those basic form ideas in there, I think is one of the things that kind of helps me kind of rough out the ideas. Um, and that's, I think, a process of just getting in there and pushing in some of the darks, pushing in some of the lights. Really helps out. And for a study for a couple hours that I spent on this, I think it works pretty well. And that is, one of the features that I like about this is just, kind of worked in there. Um, it worked for what I was doing. And like I said, I normally don't do a lot of clothing, so doing wrinkles and doing that type of emphasis, I think really helped push, kind of refine my idea. And I'm just adding little bits and pieces in here and not spending a lot of time at it, just kind of, pushing the study and pushing the idea a little bit more. And I think that's one of the things that really helped kind of form everything out. All right, so I hope this helps you out, and if you have any questions, feel free to ask.